Good day. Let's begin this class with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good morning or good day, everyone, and thank you for bearing with me that my synchronous lecture is going to be recorded or pre-recorded. Today, I'd like to talk about what we have done so far, and then after that, push forward and finish this discussion of Marion's text on mihi magna quaestio, ipse mihi magna quaestio. So we started basically by looking at understanding or getting to know oneself, and also not just getting to know ourselves, recognizing that in every attempt to get to know ourselves, we actually don't arrive at ourselves, but we arrive at a representation of ourselves. This representation of myself, you need to understand, somehow in one way or another leads me to recognition that every attempt to speak about myself is a form of reducing myself into something. When I say reducing myself into something, of course, what Marion is trying to say really is the fact that when we start to know ourselves, there's an impossibility that's always already implicit in it. And this impossibility, he expounded further when he spoke about the experience of Saint Augustine. And in the experience of Saint Augustine, what we actually saw is how, for Augustine himself, we've seen how he's understanding, how he's willing, and how he's remembering seems to, if anything, brought him only an understanding of himself as a question, no, and that's very important, no. It's important to see that movement precisely because the movement of willing, the movement of understanding, and even of remembering, as we said, really constitute, if anything, a rational faculty. And because it constitutes our rational faculty, it basically puts into question, whether we like it or not, any attempt to reduce man only on the basis of his understanding of man, no? That we only understand ourselves on the basis of what we can understand from ourselves. Of course, this is broadened by the fact that we ask, what does it mean to know the self? Or what is the cost of knowing oneself? No? And this is the question that we try to stay with a little bit longer. And it's a question that we've been reflecting on. No? And we said that if we insist on trying to know ourselves, and the cue there is in fact on the word know, no, that we wanted to know ourselves. It says, if you really want to know yourself, you always you do not actually get to know yourself. You only get to know what he says, an object. And he says this object becomes so, the self becomes an object because it is subjected to a gaze, no? Somebody's looking at it. And when we say gaze, we're not just saying gaze, we're also talking about it in terms of one that's guarding it, no? Safeguarding it, if you will. But you know that you can only guard something or gaze at something if that something is in front of you, right? Or better yet, other than you. But more importantly, no, when you look at an object and when you look at the gaze, you need to understand that a gaze always comes with a concept. No, you understand a shadow because you more or less know what what that shadow, what object casted that shadow. It's very difficult if there is no knowledge of that shadow at all. Like, for example, there's a, in a way, no, intuition to be subjected towards gaze is a it's a preemptive experiencing of something brought about by the fact of certain familiarity, no? That I, by simply looking at a hand, I can recognize a hand, for example, and that hand is important to me, and its importance is based on the fact that I recognize it as a hand, no, whether I like it or not. But a concept, you need to understand, and we've been explaining this also last time, is made possible only because of a name. No, I know it to be a human because I have a concept understanding of what it means to be a human. And as we said, naming constitutes dominion, no, that I am over it, on top of it, thus my gazing also. But not just dominion or domination, it also entails a certain definition, no, that I'm able to control it, that I'm able to define it. And that and these are very important dimensions of the cost of what it means to know, no. If you look at Marion, he says this is really what it means to really get to know something. To get to know something is to objectify it, to subject it to a particular gaze, to have a concept of it or a particular understanding of it, brought about by the fact that I'm able to name it and brand it, if you will. But not only that I'm able to brand it or name it, but that I also have dominion over it, control over it, I'm on top of it, and that I am also able to define it, no, and turn it into something finite, if you will. But we've also seen last time how these movements of that we've spoken about just now basically leads to an experience of alienation. And the experience of alienation, though he gets this one from a really Marxist perspective, is really something that says that my humanity, often reflected in my work as extensions of myself, are actually distantiated from me, drawn apart from me. And as such, this distanciation, this being drawn apart, somehow in one way or another, allows me to not see myself anymore in the very extensions of myself. And the movement of alienation is much deeper than that, for sure. But I will presume that you've understood what alienation means, at least from the Marxist perspective, and that distanciation, no? Because that will play a very important role also in our understanding of who the human person is, right? Because if object, the gazing, the gaze, the concept, the name, the dominion, and the definition leads me to alienation, the three examples of Marion are actually worth considering: the medicalized agent, the economic agent, and the political object or political agent. Are very good examples of these alienation, right? And if anything, it tells us that if you operate within a particular definition or even concept of the human person, it really erases the face of the person. And such erasure, in a way, justifies death, can justify death. And for that matter, is something we cannot ignore, no? So my particular knowing of a person can justify me killing that person. And to a certain extent, that's true, right? If I know that you are a liar, and because of an instance of lying, for example, and in my mind, that guy is a liar, for example, or that student is lazy, for example, that somehow in one way or another labels you. And because it labels you, it somehow in one way or another hinders your ability to break free from such, no. And therefore, in the war on drugs, it can be a way of legitimizing my killing you, no. And that's something we need to pay attention, because every label, every name, every concept that we have of persons, sinner, adulterer, for example, cheater, liar, and things like that, somehow in one way or another prevents the person from becoming who or she is, precisely because these labels are objectifying. And that's the reason why Marion will say, as we were looking at the text also last time, that it will necessitate a certain degree of unknowing in order for us to love a person. And let's go back to that page, you know. And it is in this page, for example, that we say and that we saw how the reduction of a person to a mere object can in fact hinder the person from growing, no? That a man cannot name man, which is to say define man, except by reducing him to the rank of a simple concept, thereby knowing not a man, but an object, possibly animated, but always alienated. And as I was saying last time, no, I like this phrase a lot, that our understanding of ourselves can be possibly animated, but always alienated. Now, I just changed the color. But it also allows us to understand how a particular understanding of the human person can, in fact, justify, legitimize, for example, the death of this person. And we've seen that in the Experientia Crucis, right? And that's why he says, the alienation which makes the defined, classified, and comprehended fall to the rank of the object is something that's very important to consider. And that's why he provides the examples that I have identified. But the more frightening postscription or consequence of this perspective, no? If you have a definition of the human person, slum dwellers yan, ganito yan, is this, no? To claim to define what a man is leads to, or at least opens to, the possibility of leading to the elimination of that which does not correspond to this definition. As such, I am only able to kill a human person precisely because I am able to erase, no, or to deny, the text says, deny to such and such a human being his or her face, and thus his or her humanity. And that's possible by defining and comprehending humanity through concepts, and by fixing its limits, and in this way discovering the one who cannot claim humanity, who we should not consider as a human person, and thus can and in fact ought to die. And we were saying last time that's very scary, because it allows you to ignore people who do not normally share your perspective. And for example, if I'm Christian, I can use that as a justification to kill Muslims, for example. And that's something we have to be worried about. But just as it has a horrific consequence, it can also have a very good consequence. And the other good the consequence is the fact that I can only love, no, or I can only respect that precisely I do not know, no, at least in the sense of being able to comprehend him or her as an object, or define him or her as a concept, no. If I know to a certain extent that there is a degree that I do not know, that might even be helpful for us, no? I can only love him who remains for me without definition. And for as long as he does remains without definition, which is to say, as long as I will not have been finished with him. No? And that's also very important, no? When I see that a human person can still grow, when I look at myself and see myself still growing every day, I recognize to a certain extent that I am still, whether I like it or not, bigger, than my actions. And for that matter, I am still able to grow as a person, grow as a individual, and therefore someone or something that's not yet worthy to die, or someone that cannot still die. And that's also very important at this point. It was Plato, sorry, it was Plato in the dialogue symposium that says, I can only love that which I cannot possess. In another words, Marion also says, I can only love that which, whether I like it or not, I cannot know. No? And kasi nga, too much familiarity breeds content. No? Too much familiarity can ruin relationships because you allow the familiarity to dictate, if not determine, who the person is, and that's quite tragic. No, and that's tragic whether you like it or not. So let's move forward. No, let's move forward. So if alienation, if everything leads to alienation, and that's something that we have to be careful about, how do we move forward? That's the question we need to confront, right? And we have the text here already, so I might as well continue here, no? And let's look at this text. He says, "Does nothing of what I understand tells me of the humanity of the other, or give me access to it? Nothing, nothing. If then I want to maintain that being a human being, nothing human is or ought to be foreign to me, it would be necessary to add a derivative consequence. Nothing that I know, beginning from a comprehensive definition of humanity, can reveal the dignity of the human being, much less defend it. And consequently, I cannot know myself as such by turning on myself any such definition of humanity. For in this case too, I would substitute for the man in me something other than me. That is precisely an alienated thing, an object comprehended by a concept. Thus, there appears the definitive weakness of every form of humanism. Not only does it claim to comprehend as a matter of fact what man can and ought to be, but above all, it assumes that such a knowledge reinforces the humanity in man, when such knowledge instead destroys it, or in any case, threatens it. So every time I define the human person with a particular understanding of what the human person is, I already exclude all those who do not fall in that definition. For example, I have an understanding of man as a rational animal, and as a rational animal, I expect them only to be rational, no? And therefore thinking. That already excludes, whether you like it or not, children with diseases, mental diseases, or even those with those that we consider special. No, for every definition, let me put a line here. For every definition imposes on the human being a finite essence, following from which it always becomes possible to delimit what deserves to remain human from what no longer does. And that's something I need to stay a little bit on, dissect, right? Every time I say, I'm an Athenian, ay, Atenista yan, we say. Or it already, in a way, defines me, objectifies me, right? into something I am always more of. No, that's why Marion would say it follows then that in the particular case of man or the human person, philosophy would have for its task not to correct our incomprehensibility as if it were a defect to overcome, but in fact, it's the task of philosophy to preserve it as a privilege, the privilege of unknowing. No? But for all of that, can we indeed preserve the incomprehensibility of man as a sign? How do we avoid the confusion? And first and foremost, does a de jure incomprehensibility not lead finally to a simple de facto unknowing? In short, can one maintain for very long the comprehension of such a fragile incomprehensibility, right? So the question is, but how can we really understand ourselves? Can we really not understand ourselves? And Marion answers that, no, very beautifully. He says, let us return to Hegel's interpretation of Adam's privilege in the book of Genesis. There, man has the power to name, to understand, and thus to dominate. That's a human capability. But Adam exercises this privilege only upon the animals, never upon God or upon himself. And that's interesting, no? Adam can name everything except himself, no, and God. No, except himself and God. And that's something you have to pay attention to. No, why can't he name God? Why can't he not name himself? Why do these two escape naming and thus the comprehension and finally dominion of man? And then Marion explains very beautifully, says that God would escape naming is conceived without difficulty. The creator is not easily understood and thus named by his creature. No, why we should avoid naming God, no, putting attributes to God is quite clear, no, because you cannot be greater than your God if there is a God, right? But later on in module 3, you'd see that that's still what we are doing, no, conceptualizing God, reducing him to a concept. But I think the logic is clear. If that's the creator, man cannot go on top of or beyond the creator in order to gauge the creator. That's like almost impossible. But why is it that man does not name himself? The second one that man cannot name, diba? And he says, no interdict is brought to bear here. Nothing more than the second commandment is necessary, which forbids making for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above. Anything, therefore, that would claim to represent God through comprehension. But wait, sir, but God, man, is the human person in heaven above? And the answer of Marion is most certainly. For this is the decisive paradox, and here there's a paradox. Because that which is fitting for God, or of whom no name, no image, and no concept can claim comprehension, is also fitting for man. For humans, and we alone among all the living was created not according to his kind, but in the image and the likeness of God. And that's the paradox there. What is the paradox? That because we are made in the image of God, then we cannot have any image because the likeness from whom we are made have no image. No? That's why he will say, man remains unimaginable because he is formed in the image of the one who admits no image whatsoever. And let's relish that a little bit. No? Let's stay there a little bit. Man remains unimaginable because he's formed in the image of the one who admits no image whatsoever. If I, for example, am the mirror image of God, and God doesn't have any image, then I should not have any image also. That's what it's saying. And I need to dissect that a little bit, no? We need to relish that a little bit, because there we see something difficult to comprehend. And that's like saying, well, that says a lot, no? If that says a lot, that on the one hand, my understanding of myself is only possible in terms of a relationship with God. And that's the first point that I want to emphasize, no? That it's a relationship with God that allows me to understand myself. Without that relationship, then I'm not also able to understand myself fully. I can understand myself as an object if I don't want to be related to anyone. But even in terms of love, right? There's a different identity that is created as a consequence of someone relating to me, no? And that's the reason why we normally say jokingly, "Uy, nag-glow ka ngayon," or nag-bloom ka, or you're glowing right now, and that's because you are in love. The relationship constitutes who you are, no? And let's consider the succeeding sentences. He says, "By right, man resembles nothing, because he resembles nothing other than the one who is properly characterized," and let's continue that in the next page, "by incomprehensibility, the one who David Tracy has named the incomprehensible, comprehensible God." Or again, he repeats the argument. He says, or again, let me change the color to red. If God remains incomprehensible, man who resembles nothing other than him will also bear the mark and the privilege of his incomprehensibility. He puts it another way. The human being belongs to no kind whatsoever. We're not kind. It refers to no genus. It's not comprehended by any definition of inhumanity. Delivered then from every paradigm, he appears immediately within the light of the one who surpasses all light. Man's face bears the mark of this borrowed incomprehensibility insofar as he reveals himself as invisible. Man is thus radically separated from every other being in the world by an insurmountable and definitive difference that is no longer ontological. It's no longer a question of being, but of the holy. No longer does the human being distinguish himself from the rest of the world, no? As Platzhalter des Nichts or the Hirt der Seins, but as the icon of the incomprehensible. Man's invisibility, therefore, separates him from the world and consecrates him as holy for the holy. Let's look at our notes and try to clarify what that is saying further. No, when we look at it from that perspective, we come to a point wherein we understand that the human person, whether we like it or not, that the human person can only be understood in relation to the fact that he's always already related to God. Related, and therefore something constituted by relations. And somehow, in one way or another, it is also in this context of the relationship that we actually recognize a certain sense of incomprehensibility, right? That because God is incomprehensible, so the human person must also be incomprehensible. And that's something we need to pay attention also as learners, right? Because as learners, we also need to see how the human person is in fact the invisible image of God. No? Theologically, of course, you'd see why Jesus, for example, is called eschaton Adam, or the last human, no? Because he's in the theological thought, the perfection of what it means to be a human, no? One that was broken by Adam, but one that's restored by the second Adam, technically. But it's also interesting how, no, when facing Pilate, for example, Pilate said, "Ecce homo," behold the human person, or behold the man. And I've been reflecting on that for a very long time. What does it mean to say, "Behold the man"? No? Sometimes I sit on our table and I look at these very painting that you see right now behind the bicycle, and just ask myself, what does it mean to be a man, or to behold a man? What does it mean for him to be the man? No, is also something we need to consider. But let's continue with Ipse Magna, because there also you need to understand there's a reference to Gregory of Nyssa. We spoke about likeness, no? Or image. That's how it's literally translated. The human person is the image and likeness of God. In Greek, image and likeness have one word. And what's the word for image or likeness in Greek? Icon. No, that's what it means. Icon. No, and therefore, I think this is a very important quote to read. No, let's look at it very carefully. The icon is properly an icon so long as it fails in none of those attributes which we perceive in the archetype. Therefore, since one of the attributes we contribute in the divine nature is incomprehensibility of essence, it is clearly necessary that in this point, the icon should be able to show its imitation of the archetype. For if, while the archetype transcends comprehension, the nature of the icon were comprehended, the contrary character of the attributes we behold in them would prove the defect of the icon. But since the nature of our mind, which is according to the icon of the Creator, evades our knowledge, it keeps an accurate resemblance of the superior nature, retaining the imprint of the incomprehensible by the unknown within it. What are we saying here? No, we're basically saying, the human person is the icon. No, and what does it mean for icon to be an icon? It doesn't mean idol. No, and that's something we need to distinguish an idol from an icon. An icon is like a window. No, when there's a certain boundaries to it. No, a window, there's a boundary to it. But looking at the window allows you to see further or beyond the window. No, it's like looking at the screen, computer screen. No, I'm looking at a screen, but the screen is also more. No, and that's the same when I look at a cell phone, for example. I see something more. No, I see further. And therefore, I have to distinguish it from an idol, right? Yeah, if I said that an icon is like a window, there are limits to it, but you're able to see more. An idol is a wall, no? Which means what you see is what you get. Applied to this image, work of art behind me, if I treat it as an icon, it allows me to see further. No, it's able to lead me to something more than the mere physical manifestation. But if I treat it as an idol, I treat this to be God. That is my God. And that's a very huge distinction, right? An idol does not transcend, cannot transcend, is limited by its very boundaries. Whereas an icon is a pointer, and as such points you to something more. Let's look at the text and read. Knowing man then, no, if we understand the human person as an icon, which means I am a window, requires referring him to God, the incomprehensible, and thus by derivation to grounding incomprehensibility in the incomprehensible by virtue of man's being its image and likeness. Augustine too comes to this conclusion, whereas St. Paul for his part writes that no one among men knows the secret of man except the spirit of man which is in him, and thus assume that man comprehends the secret of man. Augustine does not hesitate to write that, and I quote, tamen est aliquid hominis, quod nec ipse sit spiritus hominis, qui in ipso est tu autem. Domine, sis eius omnia, quia eum fecisti. Yet there is something of the human person which is unknown, even to the spirit of man which is in him. But you, Lord, know everything about the human person, for you made humanity. Beginning from this unknowing of myself, who is nevertheless known by another, no, God alone. No? So that's interesting, because he's saying someone knows you fully, but God alone. No, and that's where you see, why it's important to confess. No, where he says, accordingly, let me confess what I know of myself. Let me confess too what I do not know of myself. For what I know of myself, I know because you grant me light. And what I do not know of myself, I do not know until such time as my darkness becomes like noonday before your face. Man, therefore, our humanity, ladies and gentlemen, differs infinitely from man, but with a difference that he cannot comprehend, and which, in order properly to respect it, he should not even try to comprehend. That somehow, in one way or another, I have to accept the fact I cannot understand everything, and that whether I like it or not, I should allow myself not to understand everything, and that it is okay. And that's also very important, right? Why? Because any attempt to pin myself down, to understand myself, to comprehend myself, is also an attempt to pin God down, in whose image I am made. And that's interesting, right? Whatever I do to myself, whatever I say I am, I also say of God. That's what it's saying. Let's look at this. Finally, and above all, according to a strict consequence, only the infinite and incomprehensible can comprehend man, and thus tell him of and show him to himself. Only God can reveal man to man, because man only reveals himself by revealing, without knowing it, the one whose image he bears. Not only is it true that je sais un autre, no, I is another, but this calls himself God within man. Hence, absent God, man can no longer appear as such, but disfigures himself by taking on the figure of something other than himself, which is to say, by allowing himself to resemble something other than God. If I say, no, I want to understand myself, I want to comprehend myself, I want to understand myself, Marion is saying, but if you, yes, you can do that. But if you insist on doing that, you only arrive at an objectification of yourself. And because you arrive at an objectification of yourself, you resemble something that you are not. But you do not only resemble something that you are not, you also resemble something that is not God. For that matter, he provides a way of defining sin. He says, this is the definition of sin. No, let me change the color. He says, this is the definition of sin. Man thinks he attains unto himself by choosing to resemble less than God. The dissimilarity in the image devalues him short of God. Devalues us short of God. Turns us into something lesser than God. That's what it's saying. And barring God, man loses the human face. Thus, the soul, instead of staying still, and enjoying them, the good things of God, as it ought to, wants to claim them for itself, or rather than to be like himself by his gift, it wants to be able to be what he is by its own right. So it turns away from him and slithers and slide down into less and less, which is imagined to be more and more. And that's also something that's very important, no? Akala mo okay ka, pero hindi. It can find satisfaction either in itself nor in anything else, as it gives further away from him who alone can, no? Let me clear everything and go down. Satisfy it. And therefore, he says, I shall now make two remarks as commentary on that sin, di ba? Kasalanan. Choosing to be lesser than what you are. No? Choosing to be an object. Choosing to be objectified. No? He says, but let's clarify this. He says, first, and that's also worth emphasizing. First, he says, sin does not consist in wanting to enjoy the supreme goods, things, those of God, for they are given by God without jealousy. No? It's not a question of pleasure. It's not a question of happiness. It's not a question of enjoying the world. God gave us all of these things. But rather, sin lies in wanting to enjoy these things by oneself and not through God. Second, this entire movement unfolds within the similitudo, similarity, which is to say within the image and likeness within man's incomprehensibility to himself. That the attempt to be in charge, to be in control, constitutes sin. No? And you can look at the sin of Adam and Eve, precisely something like that. No? The desire to be like God. No? Remember, it was the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and precisely the desire to manage good and evil. No? And that's something I have to think of. No? Whenever I sin, I only see myself apart from God. I act apart from God. No? And that's a very, very interesting phenomenology of sin. No? It's a few last pages, and it's worth emphasizing nevertheless. So bear with me. So what is the privilege of unknowing? He says, by the incomprehensibility of man, by our inability not to pin ourselves down, it's designated as a privilege, one by which man, or rather the one who alone is able to say, I, ego, arrives at recognizing precisely by never himself knowing what, or rather whom it is that he resembles, who it is who preserves his identity and can name him, none other than the one who created him. And so he says, I cannot define myself, but like every human being, no one can know me and tell of me, except eventually the one who creates me. God alone knows and preserves within his own secret the very secret of my humanity. Thus, my unknowing of myself, otherwise called impossible, otherwise called impossible, through any idea, concept, or image that I may produce, except the image that another gives to me, in no way signifies a flaw or defect in my knowledge. No? That's not a flaw of defect or defect. It's an unknowing. No, it's not wrong knowledge. It's the decision not to know. No? It's an unknowing. And it is precisely in this unknowing, a certain level of passivity, if you will, that I escape the status of an object. We see that here. What does he deny man? And he's talking about Kant. Quite clearly, man is denied the status of object, subjected to an intuition and inscribed within the common experience of the world. And that's so important. Far from the absence of knowledge, doing harm to man's dignity, it appears as the first bulwark for beyond the question concerning the knowledge of man, the question of what such knowledge would make of man imposes itself. And there's where you see that level of that, why it's very important that man remains incomprehensible. And he explains this one. He says, man, undecidable to man, thus loses himself if he claims to decide about himself. He remains himself only as long as he remains without qualities other than those of a monster that passes all understanding. Beautiful. Very beautiful, in fact. And therefore, it's interesting how our relational dynamics really constitute us. The rest of the text is important, and I hope you'd still wrestle with it. Why is there something rather than nothing? And what does this do? The recognition that I am always bigger than my any understanding of it. And this is how he ends it. Let's look at this one. He says, according to Aristotle, only the divine can reach the point of thinking its own thinking and knowing itself absolutely. And man has neither a definition of nor access of this knowledge. That's very interesting to understand. The theology of revelation through other paths confirm even this impossibility as something forbidden, but rather it's a grace, and as a grace, it's a privilege for man not to know man. Man remains incomprehensible, but in the image and likeness of the incomprehensible par excellence. He thus holds a derived and gracious excellence, that of knowing himself as incomprehensible. Put another way, man appears Sorry for that. It was disconnected. I told you our internet is not so good. But allow me to continue. And it says there, put another way, man appears to himself as a phenomenon that he cannot constitute because he exceeds the field of every horizon and of every system of categories. our humanity appears to ourselves as a saturated phenomenon. No? I'll leave that as an example, as an assignment for you guys. What does it mean that the human person is a saturated phenomenon? But let's continue. He says, further, philosophy must know, and thus also not cease to will to know the one who knows, at the risk of degrading the one who knows to the status of what he knows. Beautiful. Theology in the strict sense recognizes its objects as revelation. It thus accepts, or rather claims as its highest epistemological necessity, to treat of the incomprehensibility of God, such as it results directly from his infinity. The incomprehensibility of the human being remains founded and required by the incomprehensibility of the one whose image and likeness man's bear. It is bound up with theology. Nevertheless, doesn't belong entirely or even foremost to theology. That's philosophy of religion. Because humans must comprehend this very incomprehensibility that he gains over every other thing, things that can become object. Here he cites Paul Ricoeur, and Ricoeur says, the claim by knowledge to constitute itself raises the most formidable obstacle to the idea of revelation. In this regard, Husserl's transcendental idealism potentially contains the very same atheistic outcome as Feuerbach's idealism of self-consciousness. What is he saying? In this sense, which is first of all negative, instead of denegatory, man's incomprehensibility therefore comes under the domain of philosophy. Thus, in its relation to both philosophy and theology, the incomprehensibility of the human being can be seen to define the proper domain of what I willingly call philosophy of religion. It's interesting how Marion looks at the human person as always already constituted by a relationship with God, force, call it whatever you want, but a relationship. And it is these relationship that we look at next week. Thank you very much for bearing with me and this recording. I'll see you next week. And I opened module 3 this week. Please take note of your deadlines. Thank you very much.